Welcome to this trip through one of the scariest cases in U.S. history. Tell us where you are right now to see this story, because it will take place across generations and continents. But it all began in the Appalachians, where the fog hides secrets that not even history books are brave enough to write down. The year is 1863. The Civil War splits the U.S. into many different countries. While Virginia and Pennsylvania are in the middle of bloody battles, there is a man in the mountains of North Carolina who learned to hide something much worse behind the chaos of war. His name was Nathan Crowe, and he was a real soldier at 42 years old. He carried a battered Bible and wore a black cassock. He said he was a traveling priest. Back then, the Appalachians were a confusing web of narrow paths, deep valleys, and small towns that were spread out. The war had messed up everything in the mountains. Whole families ran away from recruiters. Deserters hid in the forests, and there wasn't much law enforcement. It was the ideal place for someone who knew how to hide in the dark. Nathan Crowe showed up in Watauga County records for the first time in March of that year. When he got to the small village of Vius, he brought news from other places and offered prayers and spiritual comfort. It was very important for people to have any kind of hope. Because of the war, there were no young men left. Only women, the elderly, and people who were able to avoid the draft were left. A priest was a moral leader and someone who people could trust when things went wrong. But Nathan Crowe seemed odd in some way. From the start, he never stayed put for long. On Monday, he would go to a village, lead a service, and visit a few homes. By Thursday, he would be 3 days' ride away in another remote village. He said that his job was to bring the Bible to people who had been forgotten during the war, or who lived too far away from established churches. At that time, parish records show that he married people, baptized children, and even heard confessions. His friends and family told him their deepest secrets, fears, and stories. And Nathan Crowe kept a leather notebook with him at all times and listened patiently while writing down names and details. In June 1863, there was the first sign that something very wrong. There was a war widow named Margaret Thornton who lived alone with her sister on a property near Boone. 3 days after the traveling priest visited, she was no longer there. Sarah, her sister, told the police that Nathan Crowe had spent the whole afternoon at their house drinking tea and talking about how kind Margaret was. He asked about the house, about their savings, and whether they had family close by. Sarah woke up the morning after that and saw the front door wide open with no signs of a fight. Margaret's savings, which were kept in a tin can under the floor, were gone. Around $230 in gold coins, which was a lot of money at the time. The prayer book Nathan Crowe had lent Margaret was on the floor of the living room, open to a page with only one handwritten sentence. This was even scarier. We will give the earth to the humble, but not today. Watauga County officials started to look into it. Nathan Crowe was still somewhere, but he was no longer there. No one knew where he was, and descriptions of him were not very clear. A middle-sized white man with dark, graying hair and a soft, convincing voice. He might have been anyone. His black cassock was the only thing that made him stand out, but during wartime, clothes were easy to change. What started out as a single case quickly turned into a much more sinister pattern. When police started comparing reports from different counties, they found more strange disappearances in the Heights. The same profile all the time. People who were alone or weak, always after a visit from a traveling priest, always with no signs of violence, always missing savings or valuables, and always with the unsettling feeling that something bad had happened but no proof of it. Our journey down this dark path is just beginning. Nathan Crowe was more than just a thief. There was something methodically planned about his actions that pointed to a mind that knew exactly how to take advantage of people's trust and need. Records from Ashe County showed something that helped investigators see how big the problem really was. In August 1863, a farmer named Thomas Whitley found the remains of people buried barely below the surface near an old camp on the New River. It wasn't just clothes or personal things. They were papers, letters, and Bibles that had names written on the front covers. A different person owned each item. When they looked at these objects, they saw that many of the names were linked to people who had been reported missing in the previous 6 months. There was Margaret Thornton's leather wallet, Edwin Hayes' pocket watch. He went missing in April after letting a priest stay at his boarding house in Allegheny County, and Dorothy Clean's silver bracelet. She went missing in May after telling a traveling priest who was watching over her husband's life savings what she did. 12 separate groups of things. 12 people who stopped existing after meeting Nathan Crowe. The pattern could no longer be argued with, but the victims were still missing. In that area, no bodies were found, only these disturbing signs of short lives. The way Crowe picked his victims made it all the more scary. There was no rush in his actions. It looked like every move was planned weeks in advance. Records show that he went to communities more than once before he acted. During the first visit, he only watched, talked, and gained. Believe. On the second, he came up with possible targets. His plan came true on the third. Samuel Patterson was one of the survivors who almost died. He was a war veteran who had lost his left leg in a battle near Chattanooga, Tennessee. He lived by himself in a cabin in the mountains close to Jefferson. Nathan Crowe showed up in September 1863 and offered prayers and company. Since Samuel liked being the center of attention, he told the fake priest about the gold coins he had saved up before going to war. Samuel woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound. Crowe had a pillow in his hand and was standing next to his bed. Samuel could see the man's face in the dim moonlight that came in through the window. That person had a cold, calculating look on their face, like they were about to do something routine. Samuel fought with what little strength he still had left in his body. He screamed, broke a lamp, and caused enough chaos for Crowe to run away. The fake priest ran out the door, got on his horse, and slipped away into the forest's darkness. Samuel lived, but what happened to him was very scary. He told the police a lot of details about Crowe, which helped them make a more accurate picture of the man. But there was something wrong. When the police looked into Nathan Crowe's story, they found that the name was probably not real. Not a single record showed that Nathan Crowe had been ordained as a priest in the area. No church knew who he was. There were none at any religious group. More information about him. What kind of person was this? Where did he come from? Investigators started looking at old cases from other parts of the country for patterns that were similar, and they found them. In Kentucky, in 1858, there were reports that a traveling preacher was connected to people going missing. The same thing happened in Tennessee in 1860, always in rural areas, always during times of social unrest, and always taking advantage of people's faith. It was easy for him to hide during the Civil War. It was easy because so many people were dying, going missing, or running away. For someone like Crowe to work without being immediately suspected. He knew that people desperately need something to believe in when things are going wrong, and he used this basic need of people as a weapon. Warnings started to appear in local newspapers. The Wagawa Democrat told people about the fake priest by explaining how he worked and asking anyone with information to call the police. Nathan Crowe, on the other hand, had already gone to another place. He looked like mountain smoke, never stops, and always one step ahead. What the police didn't know yet was that Crowe had a nearly perfect way to get rid of evidence at that time and place. There were deep caves, canyons that were impossible to get to, and fast-moving rivers in the Appalachians that would always hold secrets. There was no one who knew the land better than him, and we're only beginning to learn about this dark story. The investigation took a strange turn in the fall of 1863. Police chief in Wilkes County named Robert Hricks got a letter from someone they didn't know that would completely change the direction of the search. The letter was written in a nice, almost elegant handwriting style and had a lot of information about where Nathan Crowe was going. It gave exact dates, places he had been, and even conversations he had had with people in the villages. What interested Hricks was how the letter was written. Someone wasn't writing it out of a sense of duty to do what's right. It was about them. Every word was angry, as if the author, Crowe, was someone they knew very well and had been betrayed by him. There was a vague sentence at the end of the letter. "Have a look in Bristol, Tennessee. He's back to where it all began." Chris went to Bristol, a town in the middle of the Appalachians that sits on the border between Tennessee and Virginia. He found something there that no one thought he would. Nathan Crowe had a story. It was a true story made up by people who knew him before he turned into a wandering ghost in the mountains. 20 years ago, in 1843, there was a person named Nathaniel Crowley, who worked in Bristol as a clerk in a law firm. He was married, seemed to have a normal life, and went to the nearby church. But in 1846, his wife died in a way that no one has ever fully understood. She was found near their house at the bottom of a cliff. The police said it was an accident, but there were rumors in the community that the marriage was unhappy and that Nathaniel was becoming more controlling and manipulative. Nathaniel Crowley sold everything he owned after his wife died. Owned and then vanished. It was clear that Nathaniel Crowley and Nathan Crowe were the same person after putting together the dates and details. No one knew where he had gone. It was like he had taken on a new identity, shortened his last name, and started a whole new life in the mountains. What had changed a normal Clark into a methodically planned predator? Hricks talked to old people in Bristol who remembered Nathaniel. They said he was smart and articulate, but there was something off about him. He is deeply flawed in every way. He never really showed how he felt. It looked like he was always playing a role in his social interactions. A witness, a woman named Elizabeth Morrow, who used to live next door to the Crowleys, told a disturbing story. She said that Nathaniel liked to watch people and study how they act. He would ask them small, seemingly harmless questions that would lead to private details about their lives. He also had an uncanny knack for making people trust him right away. The following details was important. It proved Nathan Crowe wasn't just a shady criminal taking advantage of the chaos of war. These skills had been a part of his life for many years. The itinerant priest was just the newest mask he had chosen because it was easy for him to get into people's homes and trusts during wartime. But the letter from someone unknown said Crowe would go back to Bristol. Why? What in the world could bring him back to the place where his old life ended? Hricks chose to wait as the best course of action. He quietly watched over the city, especially the areas that used to be home to the Crowley family. While this was going on, other investigations revealed more information about Crowe's methods. A businessman in Asheville, North Carolina, said that earlier that year he sold a man who looked a lot like Crowe a lot of quicklime. Quicklime had a lot of good uses, but it also had a darker use that not even the most experienced researchers knew about. There was another account, from a blacksmith in Mitchell County. He remembered putting together digging tools for a man who was dressed as a preacher. The client gave good payment and asked that the work be done without being seen. At the time, the blacksmith didn't give it much thought. But now that he thought about it again, the details had a whole new meaning for him. The puzzle pieces started to fit together, making a picture that was more and more scary. Nathan Crowe did more than just rob people. He carefully thought out how to get rid of them for good. He knew the area well, picked out remote spots ahead of time, and made sure there would be no clues that could lead back to him. Most scary of all, he was becoming more daring. The time between each of his actions was getting shorter. He had gone weeks without doing anything in March and April. By August and September, the time between them was only a few days. He seemed to be developing a compulsion, or maybe he was just losing his fear of being caught. We are now in the middle of one of the biggest investigations in the history of the Appalachians seen ever. But Nathan Crowe was still ahead by one step, moving along paths that only he knew. October 1863 was the month when the mountains got their first frost. The trails got trickier to get through as the leaves turned red and gold. It was time for most people to get ready for the harsh winter in the Appalachians. But for Nathan Crowe, it was time to do the worst thing he could believe. In a remote ravine near Grandfather Mountain, a group of hunters found something scary. Upstate New York. The campsite had been quickly left behind. The campfire was still going strong, food and other supplies were all over the ground, and it was clear that someone had left quickly. What really interested them, though, was what they found buried only a few feet away. The number of documents is huge. Will has property deeds and personal letters from different people. A lot of the names were the same as those of people who were known to have been hurt by Crowe, while there were records for people who hadn't even been reported, not found yet. This meant that a lot more people had died than anyone had thought. Investigators found something even more telling among the papers, a diary. It wasn't a normal journal full of thoughts and feelings from the author. It looked like a business record with a lot of set steps. Crowe wrote down information about every person he thought might be a target. There were descriptions of their habits, the weaknesses they had, and an estimate of how much their assets were worth. He put people in order of how hard they were, like he were. Making plans for business deals instead of crimes. In July 1863, an entry said, "The widow near Boone keeps a lot of money saved. She lives alone with her sister, but the sister sometimes travels to see family. A good time will soon come." This clearly referred to Margaret Thornton, who disappeared in exactly the way described. But there was something else in the diary that made the police very nervous. Crowe wrote about what he did with Clinical. Despite his coolness, there were times when he thought about how he was acting. In one entry, he wrote, "I don't feel what other people feel. I watch their tears like one watches rain through a window. That makes me different, but not necessarily wrong, just different." These thoughts showed that Crowe's mind worked very differently from most people's. He knew that his actions caused pain, but he couldn't really feel empathy for them. For him, people were resources to be used. Using the priest's cassock as a disguise wasn't just a practical move. It was also an interesting study of how to control people. Sheriff Hendricks realized they had to think outside the box to catch someone like Crowe. Normal investigation methods wouldn't work against someone so careful and flexible, so he decided to use Crowe's own notes against him. If Crowe studied people's weaknesses, then they would study Crowe's own weaknesses. Hicks noticed an interesting pattern. Crowe always went back to the same parts of the mountains. He kept referring to certain spots as landmarks and safe places. One of these was an ancient cave near the Watauga River, which he wrote in his notes as a good place to hide when needed. The authorities planned a low-key operation. Instead of actively searching for Crowe on the trails, which would have alerted him, they chose to watch these refugees. Small groups of experienced mountaineers were put together, people who knew what they were doing. They planned where to be and stayed quiet while keeping an eye on Crowe. Meanwhile, the anonymous letter Hicks had received continued to puzzle investigators. Who would know so much about Crowe? Who would know him so well that they could predict his movements? The letter's handwriting was polite, which suggested that the writer had gone to school, and its calm tone suggested a personal betrayal. One of Hicks's helpers, a young congressman named William Foster, someone who had worked with Crowe in the past, but later turned against him for some reason, or someone Crowe had tried to hurt but was able to escape and was now seeking revenge. This theory gained support when new information from Bristol came in. Mrs. Elizabeth Morrow, the Crowleys' former neighbor, remembered something important. Nathaniel Crowley had a younger brother named Jacob. The two were close, but had. The fight happened soon after Nathaniel's wife died, and Jacob left Bristol around the same time as Nathaniel. No one ever found out what happened to him. Could Jacob Crowley be alive? If so, could he tell them the truth about what their brother had become? And most importantly, was he the author of the anonymous letter? If so, his reasons were complicated. Did he want justice, or was there something more personal at play? The temperatures kept dropping in the mountains. Soon, it would be hard to move along the winter was coming, and Nathan Crowe needed to find a place to stay for the season. Investigators were betting that this is when he would make his fatal mistake, because even the smartest people make mistakes, and we're about to see how even Nathan Crowe, who was very careful, can fail. November brought the first heavy snowfalls to the Appalachians. Trails turned into dangerous white mazes, and small towns got even farther apart from each other. It was that time of year. People would stay inside, burn wood all the time, and wait for spring to come. But researchers strategically placed in the mountains kept watch. On November 12th, a very cold night, Nathan Crowe was seen for the first time in weeks. One of the surveillance parties stationed near the cave mentioned in the diary saw smoke rising from a crack in the rocks. It was too late for it to be a normal traveler's camp. Whoever was there was getting ready to. Daniel McCoy, an experienced tracker and leader of that group, made a very important choice. Instead of acting right away, he stayed put and watched. Crowe was too smart to be caught in a hasty attack. It was better to make sure it was really him and figure out what he was doing there. For 3 days, McCoy's team kept a quiet watch and saw a man who looked like Crowe coming out of the cave to get water from the river or hunt small animals. He was careful and always looked around before putting himself out there. But something was different about him now. He moved with less confidence and more nervousness, as if he knew the noose was closing in. On the 3rd day of observation, something unexpected happened. Another man showed up. He came alone on foot, following a trail from Bristol. As he got closer to the cave, Crowe went outside to meet him. The two men stood talking outside, but they were too far away for the surveillance tech to see. Even from a distance, it was clear that they were arguing. The visitor was pointing his finger angrily at Crowe, who remained strangely quiet. After about 20 minutes, the visitor turned around and started walking back down the trail. Crowe stood still, watching him go, then went back to the cave. McCoy made a quick decision. He sent 2 of his men to follow the visitor invisibly while he and the rest of the team continued to watch Crowe. The men stuck with the visitor for almost 2 days as he hiked through the mountains. He seemed to be on a mission, as he knew the trails well and was clearly headed somewhere. Eventually, he reached a small remote cabin near Shady Valley, Tennessee, where a faraway neighbor helped them figure out who he was, Jacob Crowley. Finding out that Nathan's brother was still alive and in touch with him completely changed the course of the investigation. People from Hendricks went to Shady Valley to talk to Jacob. They met in the simple cabin where Jacob had been living alone for years. Jacob Crowley was a man in his 50s who looked tired and had eyes that held many secrets. When Hicks introduced himself and said the reason for his visit, Jacob didn't seem surprised. It was like he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. He invited the sheriff in, served hot coffee, and started telling a story that no one was ready to hear. They talked about how close he and Nathaniel were when they were younger, but Jacob always knew there was something seriously wrong with his older brother. Nathaniel couldn't make real emotional connections with people. He saw them as pawns in a game, tools he could use to get what he wanted. When they were young, Jacob saw Nathaniel lie without shame, hurt others for his own gain, and manipulate people without feeling bad about it. The situation became unbearable when Nathaniel's wife died. Jacob always knew there was something seriously wrong with Nathaniel. There wasn't enough evidence to convince the police to look into it further, and Nathaniel could tell that his brother was suspicious and threatened him. Jacob ran away from Bristol, temporarily changed his name, and tried to start over, but he never really got away. In the years that followed, Jacob sometimes heard rumors about a traveling preacher who got caught up in strange situations. He knew it was Nathaniel because he recognized the patterns and how he did things. Jacob struggled with himself for years, torn between family duty and knowing how much harm his brother caused. Eventually, he decided he had to do something. He sent the anonymous letter to Sheriff Hicks, and he recently went to find Nathaniel in the mountains to try one last time to get him to turn himself in. The trackers had seen the two brothers pleading with each other to stop. Nathaniel refused to take responsibility for his actions. He told Jacob that he saw no reason to stop because he was just living his natural life and that society's rules didn't apply to people like him who could see beyond conventional morality. That's when Jacob realized that his brother was completely lost and that there was no way to save someone who was so disconnected from humanity. Hicks listened in silence. When Jacob was done, the sheriff made a suggestion. He needed Jacob's help too. Jacob knew Nathaniel better than anyone else, so he knew how Nathaniel would act, where he would try to escape, and what plans he would make to get away. Jacob agreed, but he had one request. He wanted to be there when Nathaniel was caught. He didn't want to get back at Nathaniel, but he felt he owed it to the victims. Someone from the Crowe family needed to see the end of this terrible story, and Nathaniel needed to know that his crimes would not be forgotten. The plans to capture Nathaniel started right away. We are getting close to the most important part of this dark story. The plan was carefully thought out over 2 days. Jacob gave important details about his brother's behavior that could only come from living with him for decades. Nathaniel had some quirks and religious rituals that he followed to the letter. Every morning before dawn, he would leave the cave to watch the sunrise from a certain spot on the rocks above. He let down his guard for a moment, and the team grew to include 12 experienced men who knew their way around the mountains and were used to moving quietly. Sheriff Hicks split the group into 3 units. The first would surround the cave from behind, blocking any way out into the mountains. The second would position itself along the river, cutting off access to water and the trails that went through the valley. The third, led by Hicks himself and including Jacob, would. Nathaniel usually watched the sunrise from this spot. On the night of November 15th, the men took their places. It was well below freezing, and the sky was clear and full of stars. The crescent moon gave off enough light to see the shapes of trees against the snow. Each man knew he had to be completely still and silent, because any sound would wake Crowe up, and he would disappear into the mountains like a ghost. The hours before dawn were the longest. No one moved, even though the cold air could see through clothes and fingers and make every breath clear. They waited with the calmness of experienced hunters, knowing that the right time would come at some point. As the first rays of sunlight hit the horizon, the makeshift cave door opened, and Nathaniel Crowe walked out carrying his battered Bible. He stopped for a moment to take a careful look around, then started climbing the rocky path that led to his favorite spot. Point of view. Hicks grabbed Jacob's arm and told him to wait. They had to let Nathaniel get to the top, where there would be no room to run. The sun was just starting to rise over the faraway horizon, painting the sky orange and red. It was a stunningly beautiful scene that was a stark contrast to the tension of the moment. Nathaniel made it to the top of the rock formation and stood there, looking at the sunrise. He opened the Bible to a certain page, but he wasn't reading. He had his eyes fixed on the horizon, and for a moment there was something almost human in his expression. It could have been nostalgia, or it could have been just the pleasure of a beautiful moment. No one knew what was going through this man's mind. That's when Hrix gave the signal, and men came out of hiding on all sides at the same time. Nathaniel realized too late that he was surrounded and had no way out. Someone could try to run away and be caught, or he could give up peacefully. Nathaniel stood still for what seemed like an eternity. He looked at the faces of the men around him, weighing the odds and possibilities. Then he looked at Jacob, and his expression changed. It wasn't fear or anger. It was almost curiosity, as if he wanted to know why his brother had done what he had done. Jacob stepped forward and stood just a few feet away from Nathaniel. After all those years, deaths, and ruined lives, the two brothers finally saw each other. Jacob was the first to speak up. He didn't yell or make any big accusations. His voice was low, tired, and sad. He told Nathaniel that this had to stop, that the people he had hurt deserved to know the truth, and that the families still looking for their loved ones deserved answers. Listened to everything with that neutral look he always had. When Jacob was done, he finally spoke. His voice was calm, almost polite, and he said he knew what Jacob was trying to do, but that Jacob had never really understood him. He said this in a way that was so cold it was scary. He didn't feel bad about what he did because he didn't understand why he should. To him, people were just resources, like picking apples from a tree or fishing in a river. At that moment, everyone present gasped. It was clear that they were dealing with a man who wasn't evil in the usual sense. Instead, it was someone whose mind worked in a fundamentally different way, someone who couldn't handle empathy or basic human connection. The priest's cassock, the prayers, and the performance of piety were all just a mechanism, a tool that Hrix had learned through observation and practice. He ordered Nathaniel to be handcuffed, and he didn't resist. He let the chains be put on his wrists with the same indifference that People were measured for height as they were led back to the valley along the trail. Nathaniel kept the Bible under his arm and politely asked one of the deputies to let him keep it. Chris agreed, as long as they checked the pages to make sure nothing dangerous was inside. The trip down from the mountains took all day. Nathaniel didn't try to escape or cause any trouble. He walked calmly, making comments about the weather or making observations from time to time. It looked like he was just out for a walk and not being taken to face charges of horrible crimes. This forced normalcy was more disturbing than any violence or desperation. When they finally got to the town of Boone at dusk, there was already a small crowd waiting. News of the capture had quickly spread through the communities, and there were faces of families who had lost loved ones and never knew what had happened to them. There was anger in the air. Nathaniel Crowe was taken to the county jail, which is a small but solid building made of stone. He was put in the safest cell, and guards were stationed in shifts around the clock because no one wanted to risk him finding a way to get out. The story was far from over, but at least that chapter had ended. The days after he was caught were marked by rising tension throughout the country. News quickly spread through the mountains, reaching remote farms and villages where families had lost loved ones without knowing what had happened. Truckloads of people from neighboring counties started coming to Boone, eager to see for themselves the man who had been hiding behind the black cassock. Sheriff Hrix set up interrogations to begin the morning after the arrest. He put together a small team that included Jacob Crowley, 2 county magistrates, and a clerk to do the job. Nathaniel was taken into a simple room and put in a wooden chair. He stayed eerily calm, as if he were about to talk about something normal and not the destruction of lives. Chris started by asking direct questions. How many people had Nathaniel hurt? Where were the bodies? What were the names of those who were never reported missing? Nathaniel answered some questions with clinical precision, but he declined others by saying he couldn't remember specifics. In his crazy mind, keeping records was just good organization. One of the most shocking things that came out was that Nathaniel admitted to keeping detailed notes not only about his possible victims, but also about where he had hidden evidence. He said that he needed to do this to avoid making mistakes. In other words, he thought it was just good organization. He also said that he kept another notebook hidden in a certain place in the woods that had information about cases that had not yet happened. This notebook was found right where Nathaniel said it would be, buried in a metal box under a marked tree near the Doe River in Tennessee. Its contents were even more disturbing than the diary that had already been found. Entries on 27 different people, whose lives Nathaniel had studied, planned against, and eventually killed. There were cases that the authorities didn't even know were connected, like a merchant who went missing on. They had all met Nathaniel Crowe at some point, a traveler between cities in 1861, a teacher who disappeared from her school one afternoon in 1862, and a war veteran who went to see family but never came back. They all paid the ultimate price for trusting the man in the black robe. During the interrogations, Jacob sat quietly and watched his brother. At one point, Hicks let Jacob ask questions directly. What Jacob wanted to know wasn't about the crime itself, but when did Nathaniel realize he was different from other people? When did he decide to use that difference to hurt other people? Nathaniel thought about the question for a long time before answering. He said he had always known he was different. Even when he was young, he realized that other people's emotions were strange to him. He saw people cry and didn't understand why. He saw people make friends and fall in love, and it all seemed fake to him, like actors acting. He carefully watched others to learn how to mimic these emotions. He found that if he said certain things and made certain facial expressions, people would respond in predictable ways. It was like learning the rules of a game. Once he realized he could use people's emotions to his own advantage, it became just another skill to be improved. Nathaniel wasn't clear about the first time he killed someone. He only said it happened a long time ago, before he was even married. It had been almost. He realized something important after the fact. He didn't feel anything. He didn't feel horror, guilt, or regret. He only felt clinical curiosity about what he had done. That's when he fully understood his true nature. The judges who were there were clearly shaken by these revelations. It was one thing to deal with criminals who were driven by anger, greed, or desperation. It was quite another to deal with someone who saw human lives as numbers. An old judge named Thomas Garrett asked Nathaniel a question that everyone was thinking about. Was there anything that really mattered to him? Nathaniel thought for a moment and then answered in a way that was both honest and unsettling. He said he valued his freedom, which meant he could go where he pleased and do what he pleased. He valued his intelligence, which meant he could solve difficult problems. And, strangely, he said he valued the Bible he carried not for its religious meaning. Not for religious reasons, but because it was a tool that worked perfectly for him. It was respected, opened doors, was portable, and no one thought anything of a man carrying a Bible. That answer told us more about Nathaniel Crowe than anything else. To him, even holy things that were symbols of faith and hope for millions were just tools. They had nothing real to do with real life. As the interrogations went on, police worked to find They searched the places Nathaniel had written down slowly and hard because the mountains were so big and many areas were inaccessible in the winter. But they did find some places. Caves where things were hidden and ravines where the ground showed signs of being disturbed. Each discovery supported Nathaniel's confessions and made the charges against him stronger. The families of the victims started to show up to give statements. Each story was a painful reminder of how Nathaniel's actions really hurt people. For example, a daughter who never knew her father because he disappeared before she was born. A son who spent decades looking for his mother, never being able to accept that she had just disappeared. Siblings, friends, and neighbors who were all dealing with unsolved losses that were finally starting to make sense. And the most upsetting thing was realizing how many of these people had known Nathaniel personally. He had eaten with them, prayed with them, and comforted them during the war, but all the while he was just Nathaniel. He was looking at things, making plans, and biding his time. The betrayal of trust hurt almost as much as the deaths themselves. The justice system had to decide what to do next. This was not a simple case. There were so many victims, the planning was clear, and the killer didn't seem sorry for anything. Formal charges were being made, and everyone knew that Nathaniel Crowe's trial would be one of the most important in the region's history. December came around, and the Appalachians were hit with constant snow and bitter cold. The prison in Boone became the center of attention in the area and across the country. Journalists from cities like Richmond, Charleston, and even Philadelphia started coming because the case was so unusual. Telegrams and newspaper articles told of the fake priest who prayed for lonely travelers during the war. Harrison Blackwell, a lawyer who had been in the Union Army for a short time before going back to work as a lawyer, spent weeks going over every piece of evidence, every deposition, and every page of Nathaniel's notebooks. It was a huge job. No one in that area had ever been charged with something so serious. Blackwell chose to start by focusing on 5 cases where the evidence was clear as day. Margaret Thornton, the widow who disappeared after Nathaniel visited her in June. Edwin Hayes, the merchant who let the fake priest stay with him and was never seen again. Dorothy Clean, whose things were found in the abandoned camp. Samuel Patterson, who lived through the attempt and could testify directly. And Thomas Whitley, the farmer, who found the buried things and started the larger investigation. The trial was set to start on January 8, 1864. This date was chosen carefully to give enough time to prepare the case while keeping the public's interest high. The courthouse had to be temporarily expanded to fit the expected crowds. More benches and guards were added to keep things running smoothly. Nathaniel was required by law to have a lawyer, but it was surprisingly hard to find one willing to defend him. Many lawyers refused outright, either out of moral concern or fear of being linked to such heinous crimes. Eventually, a young lawyer named Marcus Webb agreed to take on the defense. Webb had no illusions about his client's innocence. He thought everyone should have a good lawyer in court, but Nathaniel wasn't very interested in building a real defense during preparation meetings with his lawyer. When Webb tried to bring up possible arguments about sanity, Nathaniel flatly refused. He insisted that he was completely sane and that he fully understood his actions and their consequences. He just didn't think he should be punished for them because, in his mind, he had followed his own internal logic, and society was wrong to judge him for being different. Webb was in a tough spot because his client wouldn't let him mount a convincing defense. The only thing Webb could do was question the reliability of some evidence and try to raise doubts about the severity of the crimes. Nathaniel had done bad things, but maybe the most serious charges could be dropped. Meanwhile, Jacob Crowley stayed in Boone at a simple hotel. Boarding house. He was a strange figure in town. Some people respected him for helping catch the criminal, while others looked away when they saw him on the street. Jacob carried this weight with quiet dignity, knowing that he was, in a way, paying for his brother's sins. One night, an old woman named Catherine Hayes, who was the missing merchant's sister, showed up at the boarding house out of the blue. She had walked dangerous trails in the middle of winter just to talk to Jacob. She wanted to know how one family could have produced 2 such different people How could one brother be so moral and responsible, while the other could be so cruel? Jacob invited Catherine to sit down and talked with her for hours. He told her that he didn't have all the answers because he and Nathaniel had grown up in the same house with the same parents and were exposed to the same things. Nathaniel was different, but not in obvious ways that would catch your eye right away. The way he used situations to his advantage, the fact that he didn't share real emotions, and the fact that he could lie without showing any signs of discomfort. Catherine listened to everything and then asked Jacob a question that would stay with him for the rest of his life. If he thought he could have done anything differently, if there was a time when he could have stepped in and changed things. In an honest answer, Jacob said he didn't know. When they were younger, he tried many times to teach his brother about empathy and human connection, but it was like trying to teach colors to a blind person. Nathaniel just didn't have the internal mechanisms to process emotions the way other people did. The conversation between Jacob and Catherine was important, because it showed that one of the victims' families could find humanity in the perpetrator's family. When Catherine realized that Nathaniel's actions also hurt Jacob, she left that night a little calmer than when she arrived. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was understanding. In the days before the trial, things got more tense in Boone. There were constant arguments in taverns, churches, and stores. Some people said Nathaniel should be put to death right away without a formal trial, while others said the law should take its course. For Sheriff Hicks, keeping guards at the jail all the time was the right thing to do because he was worried that a mob might try to take justice into their own hands. He understood why people were angry, but he also knew that letting the mob get violent would be against the rules that set civilized society apart from chaos. Nathaniel Crowe had broken the rules of civilization, and society had to show that it understood what that meant. On the day before the trial, Nathaniel asked to see Jacob one last time. Sheriff Hicks agreed, but insisted that he be there during the conversation. The two brothers sat across from each other at a table in the cell, separated by chains and chasms much deeper than iron. Nathaniel said he wanted to thank Jacob for finally standing up for what he believed in. He explained in his strangely disconnected way that he appreciated Jacob's consistency, saying that his brother had stuck to his principles even when it was hard. Nathaniel said he respected that in the small way he could respect anything. Jacob replied that he didn't want Nathaniel's thanks. He wanted his brother to understand, even if only intellectually, the pain he had caused. Nathaniel listened and then calmly admitted that he would never be able to fully understand because it was in his nature to not be able to do so. But he could objectively see that his actions had caused pain to others, even if he didn't feel it himself. It was a strange and deeply sad conversation between two brothers who could never fully connect with each other. When it was over, Jacob knew that it would be the last meaningful conversation he would have with Nathaniel. The trial would start tomorrow, and there would be nothing else to say. January 8, 1864, dawned cold and clear. The streets of Boone were covered in a fresh layer of snow that reflected the pale winter sun. People started to gather in front of the courthouse. People were outside the courthouse hours before it was supposed to open, with some traveling for days across frozen mountains just to see this historic event. The air was tense with anticipation, anger, and the need for justice. At 9 a.m., the doors opened, and the crowd entered in an orderly fashion, guided by guards who kept strict control lines. The inside of the courtroom had been meticulously prepared, with polished benches and an American flag hanging behind the judge's desk. The judge was a man named Silas Montgomery, who was known for being strict and firm. Montgomery had been a judge for 16 years and had seen many difficult cases, but nothing like the one he would be facing in the next few days. He walked into the courtroom with a serious face, and everyone stood to show respect. Nathaniel Crowe was the defendant. He was brought in chains and still wore simple clothes, but his black cassock had been taken away as evidence. Without that sign of false piety, he seemed smaller and more normal, but his eyes stayed the same, cold and calculating, looking at every face in the room as if collecting data for later use. He sat next to his lawyer, Marcus Webb, without showing any signs of nervousness. Prosecutor Blackwell started the case with a powerful speech that held everyone's attention. He didn't use any shocking words. He did not use shocking language, but instead presented the facts in a clear and organized way. He talked about how Nathaniel Crowe had taken advantage of people's faith during a time of war and chaos, studying his victims with the same care that a predator studies its prey, and how he had used the priest's robe not out of religious belief but as a planned way to trick people. Blackwell then showed the jury the physical evidence. Nathaniel's notebooks were shown to them, and their pages were filled with careful notes. On display were the belongings of victims, each one representing a life cut short. Maps of the mountains showed where evidence had been found. There was an overwhelming amount of evidence that painted an undeniable picture of planned and systematic crimes. Samuel Patterson, the veteran who had survived Nathaniel's attempt on his life, gave the first testimony. He walked to the dais with difficulty, leaning on a cane to help him. He looked straight at Nathaniel as he was sworn in, and Nathaniel's face changed for the first time. It wasn't fear or shame. It was something close to curiosity, as if he really wanted to hear the story of someone who had escaped. Samuel went into great detail about that night, how he had trusted the man who said he was a priest and shared his weaknesses and fears with him, and how he had woken up to find that. His voice shook as he talked about Nathaniel's face at that moment. There was no anger or passion, just a mechanical coldness that was scarier than any violent emotion could have been. During Samuel's testimony, Attorney Webb tried to get more information from him, implying that there might have been a misunderstanding in the dark of the night. But Samuel was adamant. He knew exactly what he saw and what was about to happen, and only his desperate words could have thrown him out. The jury took in every word, and their faces showed how serious what they were hearing. The next witness was Sarah Thornton, sister of Margaret, the widow who went missing in June. Sarah talked about how Nathaniel had earned their trust through quiet conversations and comforting prayers. She also talked about how he had asked them about their savings, their plans, and whether they had family nearby, which seemed like harmless questions at the time, but turned out to be trick questions. When Sarah found the abandoned house, she knew Nathaniel was after them. She knew right away that something bad had happened when she saw the ominous handwritten phrase in the prayer book. Sarah cried as she testified, and many other people in the courtroom did too, but Nathaniel remained calm, watching the testimony with the same neutral expression he had worn throughout the trial. His lack of reaction upset everyone who was testifying. It was like he was watching a play that didn't involve him personally. Thomas Whitley, the farmer who found the buried things, that shocking moment he found, it changed his life. He was hunting near the New River when his dog started digging near an abandoned campsite. What he found changed his life. It was evidence of horrific crimes that had been carefully buried as if they were trash. He has been haunted by that experience ever since, knowing that he had been just feet away from evidence of those crimes without realizing it. Catherine Hayes, sister of the missing merchant Edwin, gave the most emotional testimony. She was old and weak, but her voice was strong as she talked about her brother. Edwin was a good man who had worked hard all his life to build an honest small business. He was known for being generous and always willing to give travelers a place to stay. When he met Nathaniel Crowe, this same kindness had become his last weakness. Catherine didn't ask for revenge in her testimony. She asked for something more important. She asked the court to recognize her, not to make Edwin just another name on a list of victims. He had a story, friends, and dreams that would never come true. His disappearance left a hole in the community that could never be fully filled. Over the course of 3 days, witness after witness told their stories. Each one added more to the picture of the damage Nathaniel had done across the mountains. But Nathaniel himself stayed silent and refused to testify in his own defense. We told Webb not to do it because he knew that anything Nathaniel said would probably only make his case stronger. Finally, it was time for the closing arguments. Blackwell was direct and strong as he said that Nathaniel Crowe was a unique danger to society because he wasn't someone who had done bad things out of anger or desperation, but someone who had planned and carried out crimes against innocent people using their faith as a weapon. The planning was clear, and the lack of remorse was clear. There was an absolute need for justice, and Webb did his best with an impossible defense. He said that while the crimes were real and horrible, the court should think about whether Nathaniel was really able to understand the morality of his actions in the same way that a normal person does. Maybe there was something fundamentally different about his mind that wasn't his fault. But even Webb didn't seem to fully believe his own arguments. The law was clear, and the evidence was overwhelming. Overwhelming. Judge Montgomery gave the jury its final instructions. He stressed that they should base their decision only on the evidence presented, and not on emotion or bias. But he also made it clear that the seriousness of the crimes could not be ignored. The jury went to deliberate, and the courtroom went into a tense waiting period. The jury deliberated for a full 6 hours. During that time, people waited in the pews or the aisles, talking in their phones. It was getting dark early in the winter, and oil lamps were lit in the courtroom to make dancing shadows on the wooden walls. Jacob Crowley sat alone in a corner, thinking things that no one could fully understand. When the jury finally came back, the room was completely silent. The jury foreman, a respected farmer named Henry Morrison, stood with a piece of paper shaking slightly in his hands. Judge Montgomery asked Morrison if they had reached a verdict, and Morrison replied, "Yes." His voice was low, but he was sure. He stood firm as he said, "Everyone expected. Guilty on all counts." The room was silent. No one yelled or cheered. Instead, there was a sigh, as if hundreds of people had been holding their breath and were finally able to let it out. It was both relief and sadness because guilty meant that the crimes were real, and that those lives had been lost in the worst way possible. Nathaniel Crowe took the verdict without any change in his demeanor. There was no surprise or disappointment in his eyes. He just slightly nodded, as if confirming something he already knew. It was as if the verdict were just another piece of information to be processed, not a verdict on his life and freedom. Judge Montgomery set the formal sentencing for the next day to give everyone time to get ready. Nathaniel was taken back to his cell under heavy guard, and the crowd started to slowly disperse, spilling out into the street. Some people were quiet and thought about what they were saying. The verdict was fair, but it also carried a terrible weight because it showed how much darkness one person could carry. That night, Jacob couldn't sleep. He sat by the window of his boarding house room and watched the snow fall on the silent city. He thought of his brother and how two people with the same blood could be so fundamentally different. He also thought of the victims and what they had been through. He thought of all the people whose lives had been cut short by Nathaniel's careless decisions and how he would carry that familiar weight for the rest of his days. The next morning, the court met again. Judge Montgomery walked in with documents that sealed Nathaniel Crowe's fate. He began his statement by recognizing how serious the case was. He said that in his 16 years as a judge, he had never seen anything that so deeply tested the limits of. Montgomery talked about how the crimes were planned, how trust was systematically abused, and how faith was used to take advantage of a time when the country was weak. He named each victim by name, recognizing their uniqueness, their stories, and the void their deaths left in communities. These weren't just numbers or statistics. These were real people who should be remembered. Then he gave the sentence. Nathaniel Crowe would be hanged by the neck. The execution would happen in 30 days, on February 13, 1864, giving the defense time to file any formal appeals they might want. Montgomery stressed that he had made this decision not out of spite, but because of the severity of the crimes and the complete lack of remorse. There was no other option. Nathaniel listened to the sentence with the same unsettling calm he had shown throughout the trial. When the judge asked him if he had anything to say, he was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke, and everyone who heard it will never forget what he said. He said he understood the sentence and agreed that society needed to protect its members from people like him. But he also said something that sent chills through the room. He said he didn't regret his actions because regret requires empathy, and he didn't have that ability. He was who he was, and no amount of punishment would change that. His only regret was being caught, not the crimes he had committed. That last admission confirmed what many people already thought. Nathaniel Crowe could not be saved or fixed. He could not change because he had no emotional base on which to do so. In Judge Montgomery's own words, he was an anomaly of human nature, someone who was born without the internal mechanisms that connect people to each other. The 30 days between his sentencing and his scheduled execution were strange and dark. Nathaniel stayed in prison. Visitors came from time to time. Some were morbidly interested in seeing the man who had caused so much pain, while others came for more serious reasons. For example, a philosophy professor from a faraway university wanted to interview Nathaniel to study his mind as a psychological phenomenon, and a real priest tried unsuccessfully to reach some humanity into Nathaniel's soul. Jacob visited his brother one last time the week before he was put to death. They talked briefly about. Jacob asked Nathaniel if there was a message he wanted to leave or something he wanted to be remembered for. Nathaniel thought about his answer for a while and then told Jacob that the only message that was worth leaving was a warning. He said that people like him existed and always would. They were rare, but they were there, moving through society wearing carefully made masks that hide who they really are. The only way to protect yourself from them was to be alert. People shouldn't trust anyone just because they wear religious or official clothes, Nathaniel said. Healthy mistrust was the best defense against human predators. It was strange advice from someone who was about to be put to death for horrible crimes, but it was disturbingly true. Jacob left that last conversation feeling heavier than when he had come in. He knew that those words and all the memories of his brother would stay with him until the end. Newspapers kept writing about the case, and some people argued about what it meant. Some people were interested in the evil, wondering if people like Nathaniel were the result of biology, nurture, or some mysterious mix of the two. Others were interested in the victims, writing detailed obituaries and celebrating their short lives. There were philosophical and religious arguments about free will, moral responsibility, and the limits of human understanding. Heavy snow fell in the mountains the night before the execution, making the scene even more dramatic. The gallows were set up correctly, and all the legal steps were followed. There would be no mistakes or problems that could turn justice into a show. Nathaniel spent his last night writing. He had asked for paper and ink and filled pages with thoughts on his life, his actions, and how he saw himself. These weren't confessions in the usual sense. They were clinical analyses of his own psychology. He wrote like a scientist keeping records of an experiment, even though it was his own life. People would eventually study these writings to try to figure out how the human mind works in its most extreme forms. When dawn finally came on February 13th, the sky was clear and bitterly cold. It was the kind of morning where every breath hurt and the world seemed frozen in stillness. People started to gather early, making a silent crowd. There was no celebration in this crowd, only witnessing. History was coming to an end. By 7 o'clock in the morning, there were about 300 people there, with faces from all over the region and some who had lost loved ones. The sun reflected off the snow, making an almost blinding brightness that stood in contrast to the slumber of those who were about to be executed. The gallows had been set up in the courtyard behind the courthouse. It was a simple but solid structure built to exact specifications to make sure the execution would be quick and as humane as possible. Others were there because they felt compelled to see the end of that dark chapter. The only sounds were the boots crunching on packed snow and the occasional whisper between neighbors. It wasn't a mood of celebration or revenge, but of heavy sadness. Jacob Crowley was there, sitting quietly in the back rows of the crowd. He had been debating for days whether he should go, wondering if he had the emotional strength to see his brother die. In the end, he decided to go. Someone from the family had to be there to carry that final memory and honor in some strange way, for both the killer and the victims. Nathaniel was woken up early in prison. The night guard said he had slept surprisingly well. There were no nightmares and no obvious signs of distress. He woke up calmly, ate the simple meal that was brought to him, and started getting ready with the same methodical efficiency that marked everything else in his life. Sheriff Ricks walked into the room. Around 8 o'clock, he told Nathaniel it was time. Nathaniel just nodded, finished adjusting his shirt, and stood up. He had asked not to wear the black cassock because it was part of a performance he no longer had to keep up. Instead, he wore simple, clean clothes that fit a normal man facing his fate. Before leaving the cell, Nathaniel asked for a moment. He walked to the small window that looked out over the faraway mountains, which were now sparkling white in the morning sun. He stood there for about 2 minutes, looking out at the landscape that had been both his hunting ground and his refuge. He was thinking thoughts that no one else could understand. The walk from the prison to the gallows was short, but full of meaning. Nathaniel walked with firm steps without hesitating, with guards on either side. His face kept that neutral expression, but his eyes scanned everything, taking in every detail as if he were making a list of information down to the last second. When he looked out into the courtyard and saw all the people waiting, he almost seemed surprised at how many people had come to see him die. Judge Montgomery was there, as was the proper thing to do. He read the sentence again in a firm voice, but without any sign of victory. This wasn't a victory. It was just justice being done as the law said it should be. When he was done, he asked Nathaniel if he had any final words. Nathaniel was silent for a long time, his eyes darting around the crowd. When he spoke, he smiled. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and clear, piercing through the cold morning air. He said he wouldn't say sorry because it would be dishonest to pretend to feel sorry for what he had done, but he did admit that his actions had caused real pain to real people, and that society was right to remove him for the sake of collective safety. Then he said something unexpected. He thanked Jacob for doing what he had to do by choosing principle over family loyalty. He said that in his own way he respected Jacob. Lastly, he spoke directly to the families of the victims. He told them that he couldn't give them what they really wanted, which was genuine regret and remorse, but he could give them the truth. He said that his actions weren't the fault of any victim and weren't caused by or justified by anything they did. He took full responsibility for his actions and his flawed nature. The words were strange and emotionless, but there was something about their brutal honesty that gave them a strange sense of closure. Nathaniel wasn't trying to make things right or get last-minute sympathy. He was just telling it like it was. For some in the crowd, that was enough. For others, it would never be enough. The executioner, an experienced man brought in to make sure the procedure was done right, walked up to Nathaniel wearing the black hood. Nathaniel looked at the hood for a moment and then politely asked not to wear it because he wanted to see the sky until the very end. Sheriff. The request was quickly discussed with Judge Montgomery, who agreed. There was no legal reason to deny that last request. The rope was carefully put around Nathaniel's neck by a professional. The executioner checked the knot, moved things around, and made sure everything was done correctly. Nathaniel did not move during the whole process. He kept his eyes on the bright blue sky above. If he was scared, it was so deeply buried that his face did not show it. When Montgomery gave the final signal, time seemed to stop and everyone held their breath. Then the trapdoor opened with the sound of wood on wood that echoed through the courtyard. It was quick. The executioner had done his job well, figuring out the weight and fall exactly right. Nathaniel Crowe died in a matter of seconds, his body swaying slightly in the cold mountain wind. There were no screams or other dramatic reactions from the crowd, just heavy silence. Just the sound of the wind through the trees nearby broke the silence. Jacob closed his eyes at that moment. He couldn't bear to see his brother die, so he stayed there in the snow and paid his last silent tribute to the brother he had loved before he fully understood what he was. Tears ran down his face, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of grief for the loss of who his brother might have been if he had been born differently. They were tears of relief. It was guilt that he felt relieved that the pain was finally over. After 15 minutes, which was enough time to be sure that life had ended completely, the body was lowered into a simple pine coffin. Nathaniel Crowe would be buried in an unmarked area of the local cemetery without a headstone or a big ceremony. His life ended the way it had begun. Alone, disconnected, and without real roots in any community. The crowd slowly broke up into smaller groups. There was a sense of closure, but also lingering unease. Seeing someone put to death, even if they were clearly guilty of horrible crimes, left a mark on the soul. It was necessary, it was justice, but it wasn't something to celebrate. Edwin's sister Catherine Hayes stayed longer than most. She watched as the body was put in the casket, and as the guards began to carry the coffin to the cemetery. When she finally turned to leave, her face showed something close to peace. It wasn't happiness, but it was the end of years of not knowing what happened and looking for answers. Her brother was still missing, but at least she knew the truth, and the man who did it had been punished. Sarah Thornton was also there. She held a small locket that belonged to her sister Margaret, and whispered words that no one else could hear. It could have been a prayer or just goodbyes to the sister who would never come back. After everything was over, she put the locket back around her neck and walked back to her cart, ready to get back to the life she needed to keep living. Samuel Patterson, the veteran who had survived, stayed until the very end. He wanted to make sure it was over for good, and that the man who had almost killed him would never again be a threat to anyone. When he finally left, he walked taller than he had in months. A weight had been lifted, not completely, but enough so that he could move around. There was a strange stillness over the Appalachians in the days after Nathaniel Crowe was put to death. It was like the whole area was letting out a breath it had been holding for months. People went back to their normal lives, to their farms and businesses, but something had changed. There was a new awareness that evil could hide in any mask, even the most holy. Jacob Crowley stayed in Boone for 2 weeks after the execution. He visited the unmarked grave where his father was buried. While he was there, in the snow, for 30 minutes, he didn't pray or cry. He just stood there in that space between memory and reality. When he finally left, he left a single stone on the freshly turned earth. It wasn't a memorial exactly, but it was an acknowledgement that his brother had existed, caused a lot of pain, and was now dead. That was all that needed to be said. Before leaving the area, Jacob went to find Sheriff Ricks. They talked for a long time about what they had seen, about the lessons that could be learned from that sad chapter. Hicks admitted that the case had changed his view of human nature. He had always thought that everyone had the potential to be good, given the right conditions. Nathaniel had shattered that comfortable illusion. Hicks found that some people just didn't have the internal mechanisms they needed for empathy and moral connection. Jacob agreed, but he added something important. He said that recognizing this reality didn't mean giving up on humanity as a whole. Most people could be kind, compassionate, and change. Nathaniel was just one extreme case. It was dangerous to let extreme cases destroy faith in humanity as a whole. It was tricky to stay vigilant without becoming completely cynical. Jacob left Boone in late February and went back to his remote cabin in Tennessee. He would live there for another 18 years, always alone and carrying the weight of being the brother of one of the most notorious criminals in U.S. history. Many people said he never got married or had children of his own because he was afraid of passing on something from his brother Nathaniel. Others said he just couldn't imagine having children in a world with people like Nathaniel. Stories about Nathan Crowe spread far beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Journalists from faraway cities wrote long articles about the case, analyzing his methods, his strange personality, and the flaws in the systems that let him do what he did. Universities studied the case and argued about nature versus nurture, free will versus biological determinism. Some of the writings Nathaniel left on his last night were eventually published, which caused a lot of controversy. Some people said that giving a murderer a voice, even if it was only in a false way, glorified evil, while others said that understanding minds like his was key to stopping future tragedies. The debate never came to a clear conclusion. The writings came to a disturbing conclusion, but they were still a disturbing record of a mind that was fundamentally disconnected from normal human experience. The communities that were most directly affected took a long time to heal, and families who lost loved ones learned to live with absences that could never be fully explained or reconciled. Many bodies were never found. The mountains kept their secrets too well, and Nathaniel took specific information to his grave, either because he forgot or as a final act of control. The memories of her sister Margaret were too much for her to handle by herself, so she moved in with distant cousins. She never really got over the loss, though, and died just 6 years later, in 1870. People who knew her said she died of a broken heart, even though official records showed she died of natural causes. Catherine Hayes lived to be a very old woman and became a respected figure in her community. She often talked about her brother Edwin, keeping his memory alive. She dealt with her grief by helping travelers in need and making sure that no one in her area had to rely on strangers because they had no other options. It was her way of honoring Edwin and making sure that his death had some meaning beyond tragedy. Samuel Patterson, the veteran who lived through that terrible night, married, had children, and built a life that belied the trauma he had been through. But he never told his family the whole story. In his will, he only said that after he died, they could read the official trial records to fully understand what he had been through. He didn't want Nathaniel Crowe's evil to ruin the good times he had built up. The case also changed the practical side of mountain life. People became more careful about checking the credentials of people who claimed to be religious leaders, and people set up informal ways to talk to each other. There was healthy distrust between villages, but people learned that faith and kindness didn't require naivete. The black cassock Nathaniel wore eventually caught fire. Sheriff Hicks personally oversaw its destruction because he thought it carried too much dark energy to be kept, even as historical evidence. Some people thought it was superstition, but Hicks said it was out of respect for the dead and as a way of making sure that no symbol of death was left behind. People could become morbidly interested in Nathaniel's crimes. But as the years went by, memories started to fade, as they always do. New generations grew up hearing stories about the false priest, but to them, they were just stories, not real events. The Civil War ended, Reconstruction began, and people moved on to other problems. Nathaniel Crowe became a footnote in local history books, a grim reminder of a dark time. But we can still learn from the past. Nathan Crowe's story isn't just about a bad guy doing bad things. It's also about how weak people can be used against them, and how religious and authority symbols can be used as weapons. It's also about how important it is to question and stay critical, even when we really want to believe. Finally, it's about how limited our understanding is. We want stories to make sense, and for bad guys to have reasons we can understand. But sometimes the truth is more disturbing. Bad things happen to some people because they are built differently and lack basic skills that most of us take for granted. The Appalachians don't seem to care about the small human tragedies happening on their slopes. Mist still rises from the valleys on cold mornings, and trails still wind through dense forests. And somewhere in those mountains there are caves and ravines that still hold the secrets of lives lost more than 150 years ago. Nature doesn't care. It doesn't judge. It just takes in and moves on. Nathan Crowe's crimes were not in the history books because they were unbelievable, but because they showed us things about people that we'd rather not face. It's easier to think of monsters as obvious, easy to identify aberrations. But the truth is that monsters can look completely normal. They can carry Bibles and pray. They can smile and say all the right things. That's why their story still matters, still teaches us. Thank you for listening to this journey through one of the darkest periods in American history. These kinds of stories are hard to tell or hear, but they keep important memories alive. If this content spoke to you, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like so that more people can learn about these forgotten stories. Also, share your thoughts in the comments. Do you know of any other disturbing stories from American history that should be told? We're always looking for new ones. We have chapters to read together. Until then, take a trip through the shadows of the